Okay, Sego Skanagoa, Scott Stevens, Yonkyats. That is a Mohawk reading that says, I hope it is still the great peace with you. And especially in these troubled times, I really do hope that is the case. I'm delighted to be here. As I said, my name is Scott Stevens. I'm a professor of Native American and Indigenous Studies at Syracuse University, though I am currently on a Fulbright in Hungary. So I want to talk today about the what I'm calling the competing Native legacies in the Civil War era, one being Vanishing and the other Savagery. And this is in particular how they come about in the visual arts in the United States. So I guess if we tend to overlook the impact of the American Civil War on the indigenous nations of North America when we consider the period, it's probably no surprise since we tend to approach the conflict in terms of binaries. In terms of politics, it always comes down to the North versus the South, or the Union versus the Confederacy. In terms of race, as usual in the US, the conversation starts and stops at black and white. But what is the legacy of war, this particular war, on the various Native nations living within the contested zones and on the periphery? And how can we use the visual culture of the United States to better understand this topic and the profound impact it had on many indigenous lives? We should start by realizing the polarized traditions of depicting Native Americans that were already in place when the conflict began. So we're going to start with this image of a monument built not long before the beginning of the Civil War. This is the 1852 obelisk dedicated to the Native figure Logan. So it's important to think, who is Logan? Why would settlers, white settlers, want to commemorate this person who usually was in conflict with white settlers at this point in history? So keep in mind that it was, where Native Americans are concerned, it was common to depict our peoples, at least in the 19th century, in generally two different and somewhat opposing ways. We're frequently the subject of a kind of melancholy reflection on our presumed inevitable extinction. We were said to be vanishing. And take time to reflect on that term, vanishing. I always find it kind of pernicious because it sounds like it's nobody's fault, right? That we Native people somehow vanished. And I always ask my students to think, who vanished the Indians? Now, I know that's not the proper use of the term vanish, but we are being vanished by by US history. And it's given to us in such a way that there's no apparent agent of this vanishing. It's as though it happens spontaneously, inevitably, naturally, all of which are very problematic when we look at dispossession, genocide, and other issues around Indigenous history. So pictured here is a monument to the celebrated Cayuga chief known as Logan. He lived from around 1723 to 1780, but he was made famous by Thomas Jefferson, who celebrated his lament as a piece of native rhetoric, small n, native, meaning a rhetoric which Jefferson would co-opt as evidence of an American rhetorical tradition that had its roots in indigenous people, but is absorbed and co-opted by settler Americans. And in that speech, Logan is reflecting on both settler cruelty and perfidy toward his family and community. And he ends famously by reflecting on the loss of his entire community and his kin, saying, "Who is there left to mourn Logan? Not one." Settler Americans loved this speech. It was often memorized in schools. It was part of school readers well up into the 20th century as a piece to be memorized by students. And you have to think, what was it about this speech that they so loved? Well, besides its implied rhetorical power, it also has an implied promise of indigenous extinction, right? Who is left to mourn for Logan? Not one. It's that phrase which appears, and only that phrase, which appears on this 1852 obelisk that was built on the site of a former Cayuga village, now the site of Auburn, New York. So it's part of this legacy, the vanishing, that I want to start with, because when we come into the Civil War period, this has already been well internalized by settler Americans who are at all aware of visual traditions of painting and sculpture in the United States. We have this legacy of what I call the melancholy Indian figure, right? Here, painted by the British painter Wright of Derby in the late 18th century, the Indian widow. And so she sits near the kind of trappings of her now dead husband. You see them hanging on the bare tree behind her, his tomahawk, his bow and arrow, his robe. And it's that kind of notion of the vanishing, melancholy, contemplative notion of a people that are somehow doomed by providence or by nature or by the concept of progress, or all three, to disappear off the earth. So, like vanishing, this decline is no one's fault. It's naturalized, it's expected. Historians sometimes call this notion a declension narrative or a terminal narrative, where a society is seen only in terms of its decline towards extinction. And you can find this kind of endemic to American reflections on Native America. The kind of love of the last of the Mohicans, the last pure blood, the last speaker of a language, the last traditional chief. There's no end to what one Native American scholar, Gene O'Brien, has called lasting of Native people. If we look at an archetypal American painter of the Hudson River School, the founder of that school, British immigrant, or Thomas Cole, look at this painting of landscape with figures seen from Last of the Mohicans. The Native people in it would strain the eye to really even tell they're Native. It's only the title that lets us know that it must be a group of natives, somehow featured in the narrative from Cooper's novel. But what's interesting to me here is that they kind of just appear as almost elemental parts of nature, the Native people. And they recede into the dramatic landscape, which is always the true subject of Cole's paintings. And as I said, this love of last of figures, very typical of what the scholar Renato Rosaldo referred to as imperialist nostalgia, whereby a society mourns that which they have labored to destroy, right? So you go to work at conquering a people, overcoming them, getting rid of them, displacing them, and then you start to reflect on their noble passing. Again, it kind of removes the blame, the reflection on the violence at which this passing occurred, and becomes a kind of contemplative exercise in affect, right? So this imperialist nostalgia, I think, very much informs many, if not all, of these early images that we get depicting Native America leading up to the war, so in the antebellum period. this one in particular, right? Tompkins, Matson, genre painter, likes historic scenes, not tremendously important in American art history, but known. And this painting from 1848, or sorry, 1847, The Last of the Race, is altogether too typical of the thinking that's going on. Here we have a solitary family unit that finds itself marooned by settler history on the edge of a continent, pushed to the limits of the land as they contemplate a barren sea before them. Now, in 1847, there were hundreds of thousands of indigenous people living in North America and many scores of native nations. And yet he is predicting the last of the race. It's though he's rushed to this final tableau as though delivering a promissory note to the US population that he's guaranteeing that this is the last of the race. And then we can contemplate the sadness of it, pretend that it's inevitable, take all those affective things and disguise the violence of Indian displacement, native genocide, etc. Remember, this is just years after the infamous Indian Removal Act passed by Congress in 1830, which said all indigenous peoples east of the Mississippi must move west of the Mississippi. And people will know, in vague ways, something about the Trail of Tears and the Cherokee and the 5 civilized tribes of the South. But this affected Native people up and down the Republic, right? And you have people being forced into Indian territory, now the state of Oklahoma, and other parts west. Often if they ended up in a different territory like Kansas or Nebraska, they had the double indignity of being removed again once it was decided that land was really valuable. So this is part of the antebellum period that people would have kind of taken in this visual tradition and somehow celebrated it while ignoring the realities. Why is this not there? So, all right, here's another painting or another sculpture of the same mode, right? That we have the wounded Indian. This is Peter Stepherson's sculpture, beautiful in its way, but you can see the same theme of the notion of a classical, kind of like a classical Roman figure, but who is now made native, made part of American history. So the US's claim on that notion. There was a love of the kind of defeated noble enemy figure, right? Settlers' society at this point was in a triumphal mood. They had basically won most of the conflicts they launched against Native America, and they could afford to portray Native people as noble but doomed, and basically an enemy of civilization and progress, things that it was just considered there was no way to stand in the way of. The art historical references in this and its analogs are very clear. If we look at a famous classical Roman sculpture, the Dying Gaul, right? And just going back, you can see the analogs are entirely clear. Similar, the Dying Gaul, right, is a figure that a primitive person doomed to be conquered by the supposedly superior Roman culture. The message is abundantly clear. It wouldn't take a lot of, special pleading to make the point. Here again, similar theme, Ferdinand Petrick's The Dying Tecumseh, 1856. And likewise Tecumseh, a figure much admired by settler Americans, even though he died fighting them, right? He could be admired for defending his own people for so long, even if he failed to do so, and more importantly, died in the trying, right? That's when you can lift these people up to kind of heroic enemy status, which is a strange part of the American tradition, that we allow this notion of heroic enemies, especially with Native figures. So similar to Black Hawk or other people that opposed US advancement. Think of the fact that, William Tecumseh Sherman, one of the great Union Civil War generals and later Indian fighter, his middle name, both Marshall and very American by the time his parents chose it, is not an unusual choice. Maybe not common, but there were similarly named people that appropriated names of heroic figures of Native American history. And as like Jefferson did with the figure of Logan, they co-opt them into a larger heroic American narrative, a settler American narrative. Just so you realize I'm not just making this all up, that statue of the dying Gaul, this is a plaster cast of the dying Gaul. The original is in Rome. And the plaster cast is here placed, we see in this early photograph from the 1860s, placed in the Indian Gallery in the old Smithsonian Museum, which is largely housed in what we call the Smithsonian Castle today in the mall. Now, most all the paintings that we can identify behind this sculpture are of Native people, and most are by the American painter John Mix Stanley. And unfortunately, all of this was lost in the terrible fire in 1865 in the castle itself, which destroyed so much of the early collection. But we do have this rare photograph and you can see it's hung salon style, so they're just piled up to the ceiling. But it was, I think, clear to the people that viewed both the plaster cast of the dying Gaul and then these contemporary paintings of Native communities of the distant West, the point that was being driven home in this case. Here's another one, Thomas Crawford's very prosaically titled Neoclassical Sculpture. And if we look at it, it's basically a Roman athlete with a feather headdress, right? He cares nothing, the artist cares nothing for the ethnographic accuracy of what he's portraying, but rather pointing to, again, this theme of inevitable distinction. Hence that ungainly title, The Dying Chief Contemplating the Progress of Civilization. And this was part of a sculptural group by Crawford. It's not a singular piece. It is, to this day, something you can see as part of the larger sculptural group about the theme of which is the triumph of American civilization. And it, to this day, as I said, decorates the Senate portico of the US Capitol building in DC. So senators of the period leading right up to the US Civil War would have routinely gone underneath this statue, maybe some even glanced up and contemplated what it might mean. But you have in the center of the image, you have an allegorical America. And on the one side, you have the progress of American, i.e. settler civilization through figures of war and conquest, education, a maternal figure, a farmer. And then you have spilling onto the native side, a settler chopping down a tree, that's progress. And then you have this contemplative dying Indian chief, a woman with her baby, and very strangely, I think of it as one of the only sculptural groups that includes a sculpture of a grave, of a Native American grave. It's a little grave mound that's carved there. So this is still very much part of the fabric, literally, of the American capital, the story that it wants to tell in stone about this notion of progress. Right? That same year as that sculptural aspect was completed, we also have John Mick Stanley, the person I just mentioned, many of whose paintings were lost in the 1865 Smithsonian fire. This painting, which is extant, called The Last of Their Race. So the Matson painting was called The Last of the Race. This is called The Last of Their Race. Here you have a decidedly Plains native group, Plains because of the clothing they're wearing, but they seemingly have been driven all the way to the Pacific, right, with the setting sun off to the side, in the sense of a kind of, let us call it a memento mori about Native American culture. And just like any memento mori, you usually have a skull, in this case, the bison skull. As to what it's doing on a California beach, I do not know. But the bison skull becomes, and start looking for this in American paintings of the American West. You'll often see it as the kind of American memento mori, but not for settlers, for native people, because with the passage of the great herds of bison destroyed by US policy as a means of destroying native populations. So it becomes its own iconographic tick in American paintings of the American West for a long period, even into the 20th century. And one might even reflect on it in later paintings, its popularity in the paintings of George O'Keeffe and others who kind of make it a symbol of the West. But so here again, 1857, Native people have continued to suffer some crushing defeats and the advent of being confined into certain areas that will eventually be organized as reservations, but they're by no means the last of, right? Again, this is what I call aspirational vanishing, a thing that's carried out by a number of artists throughout the period. So then on the other side of it, I said there are kind of two sides to this legacy. The vanishing native, which is usually not focused on actual depictions of conflict, but rather the results of conflict, but also masked under this notion of native people can't withstand the power of progress. And you'll have writers and historians in the period, like Francis Parkman, saying that native people will melt like the spring snows before the sunlight of civilization. So again, it uses this naturalizing metaphor. I think the scholar Brian Dippy once said, Native Americans were expected to pass on like one of the seasons, but not return like the seasons. So that sense that our spring is over and the summer is going to be the time of the settlers. So this was one common theme, the vanishing Indian, the declension narrative, the terminal narrative. But there was also equally vibrant alongside it, a kind of parallel theme of native savagery, right? And this is as old as the conquest of the Americas as well. So you didn't have to wander away from the Capitol building to find this. In fact, it was built into the fabric of the building as well. Inside the building, right, you have Kosichi's Daniel Boone struggling with an Indian from earlier period, the 1820s. And then outside on the Capitol steps, you have this Greenough's The Rescue, really an infamous sculpture that was finally taken down in the 20th century. It used to be on one of the plinths on the steps to the Capitol. parallel to it was a large heroic sculpture of Columbus, and crouching at his feet was a terrified indigenous woman. She had good cause to be terrified, no doubt. But here again, pieces like this just drove home this continuing fantasy of native savagery and its imminent danger to settler Americans. And the notion of portraying Native people as preternaturally cruel and enemies of civilization carried with it a justification for all the brutality that could be used against us, right? So if we are so dangerous, so much an enemy of civilization, and so incredibly cruel, then any means of destroying us was justified, because it was a fight between civilization and its opposites. In painting, this is probably most famous in John Vanderlyn's Death of Jane McCrae in 1804, a very racialized scene of violence, also kind of feminized victim, very white-skinned, helpless, these kind of two classically muscled Native men murdering her. This was a very popular painting, right? A very popular image, and one that, it's funny, it was presented at an Academy show in Paris first, and was really lionized there because this was kind of the period of the painter David and these kind of stiff classical poses of the action. But it had a very American taint to it, right? That was to create rather its own legacy in the depiction of Native and non-Native peoples. Here's one of my favorites just because of its crazy dynamism. This is Charles Day's The Death Struggle from 1845. And if you look at it carefully, what they're struggling over is being held in the hands of the trapper. It's the pelt of some animal still with the trap on it. And partly it points to the violence that often erupted over these precious resources in the Native Midwest and West. So you had these trappers coming in, taking away all this peltry, making their living, making people like the Astor family very wealthy in the East, but really depleting Native territories of our own resources. And so it did lead to conflict, but here just the clear savagery of it all, the grimacing Native man with the dagger in his hand and the kind of not caring whether they'll go off the cliff or not. And just, these are the type of images that kind of drove home a kind of hysteria around the conflict that was imagined in the frontier and the great beyond. So, seen from the comfort of the homes of Philadelphia, Boston, and New York, just, you could imagine it was a place of terror for them. They could probably believe anything they were told. And it was a place of racialized violence in which the settlers are almost always justified. Another John McStanley painting, again, a white woman, this time with a very vulnerable child in the midst of this presumably savage scalp dance by the Osage people. Now, Stanley was someone who actually traveled in the West and painted among Native peoples. In his own notes to the painting, it's actually not as imminently dangerous as it appears, where he says they're performing a ritual by which the main character in the center, wearing the peace medal, is intervening with his lance, against the threat of violence. It was a kind of ritualized threat against the captive, but then magnanimity by the leadership. And Stanley's notes make this clear, but nobody ever sees those notes. You just see the painting, and the painting seems to speak for itself. Another very famous image, Charles Weimar's attack on an immigrant train, 1856. Now, Weimar had never ventured west of St. Louis at the time he was painting, and in fact, created this painting back in his native Germany in Dusseldorf. So again, it doesn't have, the authority of some kind of reportage or I was an eyewitness to this thing. He's just playing on stereotypical stories that come back from the West about attacks on immigrant wagon trains, a thing we know was much less frequent than is imagined in painting and literature. And you think this is a painting that could easily come to life in a Hollywood Western right up until the 1950s and 60s, with the popularity of Westerns on film, that it was again, the struggle of civilization here as, seen as domestic, it's the place of women, innocent women and children coming to find a new life on the frontier. And then they're faced with this incredibly violent, just storm of indigenous cruelty. And so all of this went into the mindset of whoever viewed it. They would have seen various versions of these same traditions of vanishing or savagery in their growing up. And it fueled notions about Native Americans. Most people didn't know or spend time in Native American communities. They only believed, what they heard in story, song, and saw in images like this. And so not a huge surprise that it wasn't going to go well, let us say, as we approach the Civil War. Here's another right at the eve of the Civil War, Eugene Benson's Indian attack. You can barely see, there's some natives out that little window riding around horses. It's interesting as you have a kind of multiracial and mixed, mixed group of people, some seemingly possibly a child, there's a child working alongside an African person. It's not clear if that person is an enslaved member of their family, just with them, but it's also men and women fighting together. It's the family group. So it's like the one common enemy that binds them all is the native outside the building. It's apparently, there's a fire, probably from a flaming arrow above. This man's going to put it out. Even the family dog is in on the defense. So it's a sense of what to expect on the frontier, what to expect in the confrontation with Native America. But let's go up to the actual period of the Civil War. Around the same period of that painting, you also have life on the actual frontier. And of course, there were Native people well behind the lines. I mean, my own people, we have 8 reservations in the state of New York. I would say most non-Native people from New York don't know that fact and couldn't name them, right? But so there were plenty of people indeed that fought on both sides, Native people that fought on both sides of the Civil War, living within the confines of the Union or the Confederacy. But it's the frontier I want us to look at today, because that's where these two legacies, kind of conflicting notions of savagery and vanishing come into play. So here you have Little Crow, a leader of the Dakota people in what was until recently then Minnesota territory, but Minnesota had just become a state. And that meant that the rights and movement of the native people, especially the Dakota, were heavily confined, right? And they were kind of forced into signing several treaties, not in their favor, of course, that limited their actions, but also made them dependent on US government annuities for supplies of foodstuff and other supplies. And those were very often administered by highly corrupt, what we call Indian agents. And Indian agents were white settler people that often were rewarded with that position of Indian agent as a kind of political favor. So they had supported the right candidate, that candidate got into office and made their buddy an Indian agent, which was basically giving you free range to steal and sell off and embezzle any way you could all the monies and supplies that would be passing through your hands. Everyone knew it was a terribly corrupt system, but no one really thought to reform it because the people that the corruption hurt the most were Native Americans, not a high priority of the federal government or of state governments. And so things were going poorly already for the Dakota at the beginning of the Civil War, but took a violent turn downward once it got started because there were fewer supplies and late annuities coming from the now preoccupied Union government, preoccupied with the war, of course. And so after a bad harvest and bad hunt, the Dakota people were starving and demanding their annuity. They were told by their agent, you know, as he famously said, there's plenty of grass on the prairie. Why don't your people eat that? Right? So it would come to a head in September of 1862 when, after a scuffle over some stolen food, eggs, I believe, at a settler farm, a native person was shot, and then that began a full-fledged war by the Dakota against the settlers in their occupied lands. And it was violent, and it was against, you know, it was against men, women, and children. Both on both sides died, and it was an attempt to drive out US settlers from Dakota homelands. And it would, of course, raise the alarm of everyone across the Union, because the one thing they did not expect to be fighting in the midst of the Civil War was another Indian war. So this is the beginning of what we call the Dakota War. And I always ask people, if you haven't heard of it, you're not going to be alone. It's usually only taught as part of a school curriculum in the state of Minnesota, where it occurred. But it just kind of amazes me how it gets blanked in US history almost completely, right? Like, the Dakota War has huge impact on Dakota people. It is still part of the settler psyche of Minnesota, where it is commemorated. And yet it is pretty much absent from US history. So it is a violent, though brief, conflict, because by the time the US cavalry is sent up there, diverted from its other duties against the Confederacy, it makes relatively short work of it after some battles in which Native people win, but only temporarily. By December, they will have defeated the Dakota. But in the midst of all this, right, the East doesn't know what to do with this war. And they go right back to, think of the picture of the murder of Jane McRae. They go right back to the racialized violence against women and children. So here you have these monstrous looking Native caricatures killing. There's a child about to be killed, one in the background ripped from a mother. And on the ground, you have this what people would recognize as a rum container, a big ceramic rum container. And it says on it, Agent CSA, Confederate States of America. And so there was this very kind of strange conspiratorial notion propounded by some of the newspapers back east that this war that broke out, the Dakota War, was somehow instigated by the Confederacy. That would have been quite a trick for the Confederacy to use its influence with Native people in Minnesota. So you could see there's a desire to somehow link it to war against the South, even though it has nothing, they're not in any way allied to them. The war is partly a side effect of the Civil War because of the lack of supplies, but it's just the coming to the head of a really corrupt, abusive system of Indian agents that was already in place. And so you have it, visually enter the American population in these daily newspapers or in things like Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. Here we have not as cartoonish a scene, but equally, morbid and dramatic. Vultures hovering over the dead, a child impaled on a tree. So this, U.S. cavalryman is coming and seeing the after effects of Indian savagery, so-called. And again, and of course they don't distinguish between Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota people. They just use the generic term Sioux, as you'll see. An American family murdered by the Sioux Indians in a grove near New Ulm, Minnesota. So that sense of creating this enemy or really reaching into the past and finding that again, because as I said, leading up to this, there was a kind of triumphalist thinking that Native people will just always, be defeated by our modern armies and, the superiority of progress in our society. And suddenly the Union is fighting a rearguard action against Native America. That was a shock to their system. It would result with, after a kind of brief series of almost show trials, right, where they try hundreds of captured Native men, Dakota men, in a trial without a translator. And the trials for each individual lasted something like under 8 minutes apiece. They find them guilty. They want to kill all of them, some 600 or so. And President Lincoln thinks that's just too many. And since if it is a war, they're certainly not summarily killing all captured Confederate troops, but they have to please the populace at some level. So they kind of arbitrarily select 38 men, which they want to claim are the ringleaders of this. Again, with the absence of translators and such, there's very little notion that this was in any way accurate, but it was simply a sop that they were throwing the American public to show that some kind of punitive, vengeful justice was going to be undertaken. So on the day after Christmas in 1862, this special scaffold was built in Mankato, Minnesota, and 38 men were hanged simultaneously, which is the largest mass hanging in US history. And here, in this kind of carefully colorized, hand-colored lithograph suitable for framing in your home, you could have an image of this. And of course, this remains a very sensitive issue among Dakota people to this day. Of course it does. And yet again, I would say, how many of us ever encountered this in school, in college history courses? These things, they make me marvel, because I just think Native history and its connection with something as large and as written about as the American Civil War still seem miles and miles apart, as though there's no reason for one to engage in this aspect of Civil War history. Of course, the Dakota weren't the only people that came into conflict with the Union or the Confederacy during this period of conflict. In the far west, in Navajo territory, or Dinétah, the homelands of the Navajo people, you also had, again, a largely theoretical notion about the dangers posed by the South regarding the California gold fields to the west. So it was imagined that troops from Texas and possibly Arkansas would march through Navajo territory and be allowed then to have an access to the gold fields of California, which they would then presumably use to fund the Confederate war effort. Not to say that there weren't plans or aspirations for this, it was possible, but it became a justification for really subjecting and subjugating the Navajo people under the Union's might. And so Kit Carson and others, but Kit Carson, one of the main leaders against the Diné or Navajo, defeats Navajo people, the Navajo, militias or their armed forces at the Battle of Canyon de Chelly, which will create the situation by which all Navajo people in 1864 are going to be rounded up, as many as they could capture, rounded up in their homelands in kind of northern sections of Arizona, New Mexico, southern portion of Utah, rounded up in their homelands between the four sacred mountains, and forced marched over 800 miles into the desert of New Mexico, southern New Mexico, to a place called Bosque Redondo, where they will be held for 4 years in the most miserable conditions possible. And this episode in Diné history is called The Long Walk. And it represents, an incredibly traumatic event in their history, one certainly still remembered and talked about. Many families perished on the way due to exposure, lack of nourishment, lack of water. They were being herded around as hostiles and then forced to live under conditions at Bosque Redondo where they were put in a kind of prison camp alongside their traditional enemies, Apaches, who had been also herded into this same camp. And it was a kind of hell on earth. And this fairly famous, at least in Native American history, early photograph of women there. Now you'll look behind them, it seems like you have a broken column and some neoclassical artifacts. It's because the photographer is traveling with a screen background, like one of those phony backgrounds you get in a mall family portrait of trees and leaves and things. And here he had some kind of neoclassical, obviously something that was not designed to have in a photograph with women prisoners of war. But again, the expressions I think are extremely telling. And 4 years of this incarceration, and then finally allowing them to return to their homelands where they live today. Obviously, 4 years of trauma, but not part of our visual memory, our collective visual notion of the events around the American Civil War. And my job, if anything, as a Native person who's a professor of Native American Studies is to get outside of that discipline and get people in American history, American literature, American art history to start attending to the indigenous peoples of this continent. We are still here. We've been here all along. We are part of all these traditions, though little known. And it's just going to be my hobby horse till the day I die, that I want people to better know this material, because it shocks me that it's not known. Yet another potential theater of war would be Colorado territory, not far from, the borders with the Confederacy and buffered by Indian Territory or Oklahoma, which was already divided by those who were sympathizers of the Confederacy and those who were sympathizers of the Union among the Native people there, and the attendant violence that went with it. It was so nervous-making to peoples in those territories outside, like the Cheyenne and Arapaho, that they sent a delegation to the White House in 1863, in the midst of all this, to make clear their neutrality and their intentions of remaining at peace with both and not partaking in any alliances, etc. So here you have someone from Matthew Brady's studio has photographed some of this delegation and some of the men and women associated with the White House and the conservatory there, in a kind of haunting photograph, because within a few months' time, most of those Native men will have been murdered in the West at a place that we know as Sand Creek. Now, Sand Creek, relatively obscure. You have this map of Colorado, and it's, along this little area of the Sand Creek. And it was an encampment of Cheyenne and Arapaho people that were there basically as refugees, living peacefully. But Governor Evans, the territorial governor, sees an opportunity to basically get rid of indigenous people under the guise of the potential hostiles. There's a conflict going on with the Civil War. So a lot of excuses easily found. They post this famous poster, "Attention Indian fighters," a call for local volunteers. Colonel Chivington, who was a Methodist minister, apparently not a very humane one, volunteers to lead the raid. He won some notoriety earlier on at Picacho, the Battle of Picacho Peak, against the Confederacy. And so he is respected, but he is a dyed-in-the-wool Indian hater, right? And quote from him here: "Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians." So this is the man that led his voluntary cavalry troops against a largely unarmed camp, because many of the young men were out hunting. And when they arrived in late November, the 29th of November, 1864, the people in the camp were largely elderly, men and women, and then women and children. And they proceeded to butcher their way through that camp in what we now call the Sand Creek Massacre, if indeed we remember it at all. We do have, in terms of visual culture, Howling Wolf was a survivor of that. He was a very young man at the time, and this is remembered over a decade later, about a decade later, in a ledger book drawing he does. And so, again, this is him, his own figure. He puts his howling wolf as his signature on top. It's part of a really beautiful ledger by him that's at Oberlin College. So we also have, indigenous visual record of these things, and we're starting to get more of that after this period. But it's again a mystery to me. These three very important events to their respective nations: the Dakota War, the Navajo Long Walk, the massacre at Sand Creek. All of them are part of the American Civil War, and they share in a kind of visual legacy. As you notice, photography has moved into the scene, and illustrated newspapers and so on. It doesn't have to be a fine arts painting anymore to carry this message. And in fact, these stereotypes are much more pernicious when broadcast as widely as a newspaper can do so, and the kind of 19th century version of going viral. So all people had to do is look at those horrific images printed in Frank Leslie's illustrated paper or in Harper's, and they would feel like they had, some understanding of Native people in the West. And of course, it was a horrifically violent one. So these are part of that legacy that I want to look at, along with the vanishing. And note, this is from after our period, but it just strikes me that when I came across it, when I worked at the Newberry Library, you have this little Uncle Sam as a child. So this was from the Irish World, which was an Irish immigrant paper in Chicago in the 1870s. And remember, the end of the Civil War is the beginning of the Indian Wars that will go on unabated in the West until 1890 with the massacre at Wounded Knee. So the Civil War doesn't stop for Indigenous people. In fact, it's the beginning of a new type of war immediately after the American Civil War, one that aims its sights at Native territories and land, especially land, in the West. And there's no break between the Civil War and the Indian Wars. One just continues into another arena. So here you have little Uncle Sam and his Indian protege, it says, saying to Columbia, the allegorized America, Mrs. Columbia, she says, "What's all this trouble about?" And Sammy says, "Boo-hoo, I got all his playthings, and then I kicked him into the corner, and I was gonna chuck him out the window when he up and slapped me. Oh, Ma, wouldn't you please exterminate him?" It just struck me when I found this, like, even in the period, it was so clear to people, the just incredible unfairness. And of course, it easier to voice from a recent immigrant than from, longtime settlers in North America. That notion of, I took everything he owned, I confined him in the corner, I was just going to get rid of him altogether, when he had the temerity to slap me, i.e. to fight back in the Indian Wars, which were happening. Wouldn't you please exterminate him? And I just think, wow, this was just in like a daily paper in Chicago in 1873, but it captures the mood of the post-Civil War world, at least as it regards the Indigenous people of the United States. So with that, I kind of leave you. I have just this one last image from the beginning of the 20th century. Edward Curtis, the great photographer of Native America at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. But even in his beautiful, collection of photographs, the first image he shows is of a Navajo group going toward the sunset, and he titles it "The Vanishing Race." It's an addiction of the US culture, this vanishing notion, and it's one that we haven't really shaken at the same time. So I just want to leave you with this image because to me it brings together a lot of the themes we're talking about, and shows their kind of longue durée from the 18th century, the Indian widow, to the early 1900s, still vanishing, still disappearing, still going into the sunset. So with that, I thank you for your attention. Say Nyawa Goa, which means a great thank you in Mohawk, and wish you well. Thanks.